So the issues that face us when we're using a limited palette are essentially the same issues that we deal with in any given painting, especially with regards to color theory. So we really have to deal with color, value, and saturation. When you're painting a scene from life or even from photography, our job as a painter is to basically look at what we're trying to paint, what color we're trying to mix, and the first question you ask is, what color even is that, right? Is it blue? Is it green? Is it red? And you're trying to identify that. Then for realistic paintings, I think the most important aspect of color mixing, and even without color, even just in black and white, is the identification of the tonal value, which is thinking how dark or how light something is. This is essentially how we show form. This is how we show light. This is how we delineate the shapes of things and perspective. So many things kind of revolve around value. So in a lot of ways, value's the preeminent choice that we have to make. And then lastly, along those lines, you'll also think about color saturation. And color saturation is sort of how gray or how fully bright in terms of, a red or a blue. Is it like straight out of the tube? That's going to be full saturation. Is it like really grayed down or dulled down, whether with black or white or with complementary colors? And this is also something that we're constantly thinking about. And a fourth thing that I could have mentioned that really does strongly affect the outcome of our painting is color temperature. And for every color that you can paint, we also have to often think about, is it warmer, basically closer to yellow, or is it cooler, closer to blue? And probably that is a subject for a video in of itself when we think about how do you have a cool blue versus a warm blue? How do you have a cool yellow versus a warm yellow? But when we're painting with a limited palette, the limitation of what colors you choose strongly affect all of those aspects of painting. And so a lot really is involved in even the selection of a limited palette. And before we go on, we really should talk about what even is a limited palette. So there are many different types of palettes out there. When I'm talking about a palette, effectively I'm discussing the number of colors that you're going to paint with. And as you can see here, I really just have 3 colors plus white. And in general, when we talk about the number of colors, we don't really count white as a color or black. Technically, they are considered shades or tints or whatever terminologies you want to use, but they aren't strictly colors per se. And so when we're talking about colors, we're talking about things like red, blue, yellow, and those are the primary. Secondary colors: purple, orange, etc., greens. And obviously, if you've ever painted before, or even if you're just starting out, when you're mixing colors on the palette, there's sort of an infinite spectrum of shades of color between those primaries. And so by selecting a certain number of tubes to lay out on your palette, you're kind of selecting the amount of bandwidth that and variety that you can select from. So if you think about, let's say you're going to mix right now, I'm trying to mix sort of a darker color, and when I'm using ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson permanent, and lemon yellow and titanium white here, and this is a gouache painting. So I'm trying to, at this point, lay in a lot of my darks in the scene, which are going to be, these tree trunks, and I'm sort of trying to follow a lot of the principles that I would use, and so that I would use in an oil painting. And so typically, right now, I'm trying to get the darkest color that I can get, which means a combination of ultramarine and alizarin crimson. That, strictly speaking, will give me my absolute darkest value in terms of what I can get from these three colors. The problem is that if I just use ultramarine and alizarin, I have an extremely saturated dark. It's going to be a very saturated purple, essentially. So you can see that to combat that saturation, I'm dipping into the lemon yellow. But the problem that arises with that is that because the lemon yellow is such a higher value, it's so much of a brighter color or closer to white, that it lifts the tonal value of this dark that I'm mixing. And as I'm painting this, the wetter spots of paint are looking darker, but then as you can see some of the parts that I've painted already that are dry, as they dry matte, that it really kind of fades to something that's not as dark as you could get with different color combinations. And so, kind of looping back to what I was saying with regards to what is a limited palette, effectively, technically a limited palette can be any limitation that you put on yourself with regards to the number of colors and hues that you're going to use. But I personally think that a limited palette is any number of colors under 6. And so when I first started out, I heard people talk about a palette of 5 or less. There are palettes of 3 that are very common. For instance, there's the so-called Zorn palette, which is 3 colors. It's actually that's technically 2 colors plus black and white. So the Zorn palette is black and white, yellow ochre, and cadmium red. So that, as I said before, I don't really consider black or white to be a color. So that would be 2 colors plus black and white. What I'm doing right here, where I have 3 distinct tubes of color plus white, I consider that a triad of 3 colors. And you can grow it out. So when I first started painting, I painted with a palette that was ultramarine blue, burnt umber, cadmium yellow, cadmium red, and white. So 4 colors plus white. And I think you could add even something to that. So you could add some other earth tones like a burnt sienna, or give yourself some variety with one of your primaries, or even add a secondary color in there depending on what you're trying to go to, and you could technically still consider that a limited palette. So I'm sure that other people have different opinions on this, but I guess I would say, maybe I would correct myself and say, 4 colors plus white or less is sort of what I mean when I say a limited palette, but you can obviously imagine many other types of limitations for yourself. I think, the most limited that you could do would literally be 1 color plus white. So black and white, or burnt sienna and white, monochromatic type paintings like that. And you could even try painting transparently with watercolor, or any of these mediums can be done transparently. So even you could technically do just 1 tube of color with no white involved even, and that would teach you a lot as well. So I think the main thing that you want to think about when it comes to a limited palette is circling back to this idea of color value, saturation, and possibly color temperature, because those are the parameters that we always think about when we're mixing color, and those are the parameters that you're always thinking about when you create your limited palette. One way that the limited palette, this one in particular, kind of is causing me some issues as I'm painting here, and I briefly touched on it before, is that these 3 colors, this triad or this gamut of color, is strongly compressing my tonal value range. And so in terms of the full spectrum of color from black to white, as well as full saturation and all of those things, I don't have a color combination that really can get me close to black. And so compared to a fuller palette, my tonal value range is not as great. The range from my darkest dark to my lightest light is not as great as it could be if, for instance, I did have a black or a burnt umber or some other colors that I could use to mix a black. And so because I'm limited with the low end basically of my color palette, then that's what I would consider a compressed tonal value range. Now that's not inherently bad, actually. There are many amazing paintings with compressed tonal value ranges, and it's something that I really want to explore more and get better at doing. And I think sometimes I maybe rely a little bit too heavily on high contrast scenes to kind of depict what I'm trying to paint a lot of times. And this scene right here is a prime example where, as I'm looking at it, I'm really attracted to the light that's diffusing through these trees and the strong verticals and horizontals, and trying to capture that like bright early summer greens and that bright strong sunshine on these trees. And when you're thinking about depicting light, a lot of times this is sort of a truism about depicting form in general, that the light itself is often revealed by the extent that you also paint darkness in there. Like the darkness helps enhance the sense of light. And so it's difficult to get a super strong sense of light in terms of tonal values when your tonal value range is compressed. And so that's both an issue and an asset. I think a lot of times with a compressed tonal value range, you are able to create, I'll say maybe sometimes more evocative and atmospheric scenes. And if you go out on an overcast day or a day where there isn't strong shadow and light, and you just observe it, you'll see that the range of tonal values is much more compressed. And I find that painting a compressed tonal value range is often more difficult. And so in a way, you can help yourself if you're purposely trying to paint a compressed tonal value range by using a limited palette like this. And conversely, I think what I'm trying to do is almost work against that compression, and that I'm trying to paint a very high contrast scene with not a very high contrast palette. And so this is sort of the beauty but also the frustration of limited palettes, in that you may run up against the boundaries of what that palette can do, and I guess it's up to you to decide if that's working for you and if you're learning from that, or if it's frustrating you or hindering you from accomplishing what you're trying to accomplish. I think that the compression of the tonal values and just the compression of the color gamut as well can sort of force you to really focus on your tonal values and to choose striving for tonal value over color and tone and chroma and all the other aspects of color. So because the palette is limited, because the range is limited, even if you're limited in the range of tonal values, just the fact that you're working in this limited bandwidth of color forces you to really consider your tonal value so much more if you want any sort of aspect of realism. And like I said, when there's a component of the value range that you're not able to achieve with your color gamut, you're immediately aware of that. And so it might not be exactly what you want when you're in the middle of painting it, but for here, as I'm painting right now, I'm very much aware that for my sky, I need it to be slightly darker so that the brightness of both the ground here and the tops of the trees and the light shining through the trees, that in order to get the amount of saturation that I need with this yellow and the lightness of tonal value that I need to lower the tonal value of the sky to make these parts seem bright. And I think as I'm painting this should hopefully start to emerge more. Likewise, as we're talking with the vertical planes, with the trunks and branches of the trees and trying to get my darkest dark, I'm only able to get so dark before I can't go any darker with this specific palette. And trying to think about these issues is forcing my mind as I'm painting here to really lock in on tonal values. And that's like one of the most important aspects of painting. So I think that even if the color gamut that you're using in painting in a limited palette doesn't give you the broadest tonal value range, it still forces you to think about tonal values because of that fact. I think another aspect that we have to address, of course, is that using a very limited palette, a triad of colors or even less, is going to promote a form of unification, both in color, in tone, in value, in every component of color and every component of the palette itself. You're going to have an aspect of unification because of the limited nature of the palette. And so this is really good because oftentimes in all aspects of art, not just even visual art, it's very easy for us to become very fractured and overly broad in our artistic statements, overly broad in our color statements, overly broad in our palette choice, overly broad in our value range. And so by limiting our choices, we focus our choices. By limiting our color palette, we focus that palette. And so that creates a unity across the painting, which I think is a component of more nuanced and interesting art. And so I think that you'll notice that as you look at artworks by master painters, you will notice that there's a unity in the statements that they're making with their shapes, with their lines, with their composition, with all of the aspects, but especially oftentimes a unity with their color choices. And so one way to automatically sort of guarantee that is by limiting your palette. I think along those lines, depending on how adventurous you get, and I mean the palette I'm using here is relatively traditional in that I have a very traditional normal blue that you would expect in a landscape painting. I have a very normal yellow and a relatively popular red. But you could, the sky is the limit in terms of what colors you do pick. And depending on the choices that you make in terms of color saturation, in terms of the tonal value range, in terms of the warmth and coolness of the colors that you pick, and the severity of the limitations across all those spectrums, you can create some really unique looks for the paintings that you do. And so you can pick, for instance, a very limited palette that really emphasizes warm colors or really emphasizes cool colors. You could pick a limited palette that really doesn't go very deep in the tonal value range so that your tonal values are extremely compressed. There's so many ways that you can do it. You could say, I want two of my colors to be very desaturated and one of them to be ultra saturated. So an instance of that would be, if I picked yellow ochre for my yellow, which is a rather kind of desaturated yellow, almost like the toned color of my surface here, and maybe like burnt sienna for my red, which is just an orangey earth tone, right? But then maybe for my blue, I could pick phthalo blue, like the most saturated, intense blue that I have. So you could totally flip that on its head. You would get an entirely unique look by painting your paintings like that. But you could totally flip that on its head just by replacing the phthalo blue, let's say, with a blue that's more desaturated, ivory black Payne's gray, would be extremely desaturated blues, and you could come in with a cadmium red as like a super saturated high chroma red. So that would give you an entirely different look and feel. And so in a way, you can kind of create your own style without going the Picasso route, without having to reimagine all of the components of art, just by coming up with creative palette choices. And even as I'm saying this, like, I'm getting excited about wanting to try some of these scenes with more kind of out there palette choices that I haven't done before. A lot of times, like, to be honest with you, this particular palette that I'm using right now, these three colors are colors that I'm more or less familiar with. And so there's an asset in that, it helps me paint efficiently, and I feel like I know what I'm doing. But on the other hand, using colors that I haven't used before, or in ways I haven't used them before, is also a great learning experience. I think that however you slice a limited palette like this, whatever direction you choose to go with it, it does force you to really think about what you're doing in a different way. And so ultimately, even just as I'm describing to you the idea of using ivory black, yellow ochre, and cadmium red, that's the Zorin palette. But what if you replace the ivory black with Prussian blue? What if you used ivory black, burnt sienna, and cadmium yellow? All of those ideas really get me really excited and like are intriguing to me. And I think so often, especially as plein air painters and urban sketchers, we think that, I really need a really cool subject to paint. I need a really cool scene. I know for myself, I really like scenes with strong lighting and strong form. And I like, to find leading lines. These are all things that I enjoy painting. And so sometimes I really struggle when I can't find that. I go out looking for a scene. I really want strong shadow and light, or I want, a strong depiction of form. I want to see multiple layers of depth, and I can't always get that. And I feel like, man, there isn't a subject. Well, you could go out and you could paint literally anything with a bad composition, without strong lighting, without any of these aspects that maybe you prefer, and make the subject of your painting the exploration of a limited palette. Make the subject of your painting seeing what happens if you mix Prussian blue, burnt sienna, and cadmium yellow. What would that look like? You would get some really intense greens and blues and like really weak reds, right? What would happen if you have two really bright saturated colors and only one desaturated weak color? There's so many layers to that onion for you to explore. And I'm saying this to you guys as much as I am to myself, because I don't know how many times I go out and I feel like, man, I can't find a subject that I really want to paint. I can't find a scene that's really appealing to me. And the reality of the issue is like, when that happens, maybe that's the day that you need to make color exploration your scene and the subject of your painting. I do think that because a lot of times a limited palette will force you to think longer and harder about what you're doing, and that the color palette itself might be kind of an enigma to you. Maybe it's something you've never used before. Now, one of the drawbacks, you could think of it as a drawback, is that it can take you a lot longer to mix your colors. And so it might take you a lot longer to make the painting. I think that it kind of forces you to think about what you're doing, and that sensation might not be one of total relaxation and fun all the time. This is, by the way, what I'm doing here right now, kind of poking these smaller sky holes and trying to create the sense of like the light coming through these trees in the distance. This is something that I really have only been doing for a couple paintings now, but I really discovered this with photography, and you see that like the spindly branches of trees at the horizon, that you see a lot of these like really tiny sky holes, and I am really enjoying adding that in. I feel like it does give that sense of depth like I was talking about, and that sense of the light spilling through infinite tree branches. So this is a new technique for me. I think this is maybe the first time that I've actually tried it on a plein air painting. I've done it before in the studio, but I recommend doing that. In a way, it's sort of like subtractive painting. I'm not painting the branches, I'm painting the light that's going around the branches, and I really enjoy doing that. But yeah, like if it takes you longer to mix your colors, is that even a bad thing? Because I think a lot of times, especially if you've been doing it for a little while, you can just kind of go on autopilot. You can feel like you're making automatic choices. I think a lot of the times we feel like maybe we don't even know what we're doing, to be honest, and all of a sudden a painting just emerges. And while that can be a pleasant experience, I think that knowledge that's hard earned through experience because you slowed down and you thought about what you were doing is extremely valuable, because that means that technique, that result is repeatable for you. And just like I said, painting these really small tendrils of sky holes in the background, I had to try that technique out first and go, I really like that result, before I could utilize it again. And here I am using it in a plein air painting, and I like the results. I think another lesson that painting with a limited palette can teach you is that you can actually learn a lot about an individual color. So let's say that you're painting with a triad of colors: ultramarine blue, cadmium yellow, cadmium red, and white. And you get used to that setup, but then you want to experiment with a different kind of a blue. So if you just rotate out your blue for, say, Prussian blue, but keep the other yellow and red that you're familiar with, that's going to essentially give you paintings where you isolate the differences in a different kind of a blue, rather than using multiple blues, multiple reds, multiple yellows, earth tones in an expanded palette, which that's totally fine. But really, you're able to totally learn what are the strengths of Prussian blue, what are the weaknesses of Prussian blue, how strong is its tinting strength, how low does its tonal values go. And that can be super, super valuable for you when you actually do want to expand your palette, or you want to buy new tubes of color. It allows you, in a sense, to do a landscape painting or a realistic painting where you're still controlling for all of the factors of color, tone, value, shape, line, and all of the things that we think about. But you can also isolate a new tube of color and see what it does for you, what you like about it, what you don't like about it, what its strengths are, what its weaknesses are. And so I really think that using a limited palette can be one of the most beneficial things for you to really gain knowledge about all the different colors, and then you can kind of pivot from that into really unique color combinations, and come up with your own individual color style. I think along with that, the limited palette will often help simplify your painting process. It can teach you really how to paint systematically. I think when you have less options on the palette, it really causes you to think through the steps more clearly and not get lost in a labyrinth of many colors and many different tonal values. You have a limited bandwidth that's really easy to think through and to digest. And so you're able to think about your tonal values, you're able to think about your shapes, you're able to observe the scene because you're working with a limited palette, because you're working with a limited number of options. And really, I think it helps you gain mastery over those options. So rather than feeling overwhelmed or really having kind of an intermediate or moderate appreciation for what all of your colors do, I think that if you regularly practice with a limited palette and with the same 3 colors, you're going to actually gain mastery over what those specific colors do. You're going to be able to become extremely proficient at utilizing those colors, at knowing their strengths and knowing their weaknesses, like we just discussed about. And that is going to make it so much more powerful for you. So you won't get, like me, oftentimes, especially if I take kind of a break from plein air painting or whatever, I can feel super overwhelmed. I can feel lost. Like, what's the order of things? I don't know about you, but many, many times when I go out, I feel like I've completely forgotten how to paint. and I have to learn from scratch, right? And so I think by having a simplified system where you do learn how to paint systematically, you learn to think and kind of paint analytically, because you can control the variables. You're thinking through those variables as you go. I think the limited palette is really, really beneficial for that. And so it can help you get over that feeling of being lost and not knowing what to do. Because especially as you apply this to multiple paintings and multiple seasons and gaining more experience and traction with the same limited palette, then I think even if you go on to then expand that palette, you're still carrying that knowledge and that experience forward. You're carrying the repetitions that you're going to go through of painting systematically, thinking about, let's say, line and shape, tonal values, colors and hues, color temperature, etc. And if you build that system for yourself, whatever system of painting you prefer, you're going to be much more efficient, much more analytical about what you're doing, have a greater sense of, yes, I do know what I'm doing, and even being able to reach for things that maybe you've never done before and have an idea for how to do that. So, one of the ways that I think it really helps you is with color mixing. I think, when you talk to beginner painters or even intermediate painters, color theory, color mixing, looking at your scene and figuring out what color even is that, what's that shadow color and how do I get there? Having a limited palette will really help simplify those ideas for you, because you only have so many color mixtures available, right? And so being able to do that, you're going to gain a lot of experience solving those problems for those colors that are a little bit vague. And the other thing too is sometimes your color palette maybe possibly can't even reach certain colors, right? And again, that's where you learn about either the tonal limitations or the chroma limitations, and then it kind of motivates you to start experimenting and trying other colors and other color combinations. Along with that, it'll help you see beyond just chroma and value. You'll be able to look at a scene and say, look at a yellow, like the yellow green of these tree leaves with the lights shining directly on it and through those leaves, to see that it's like a very warm green, that I'm almost using pure yellow, actually. That's how warm the green is. Looking at your shadows and seeing cool shadows, it'll give you a deep appreciation for the observation of color temperature, not just color in of itself, not just value in of itself, but actual color temperature. And I think that's sort of oftentimes the next step for a lot of beginner to early intermediate painters, and it's something I'm working on myself, is not to just go, okay, nailed the tonal values and that that tree trunk is a dark brown, but to actually play with or push or manipulate the temperature of that brown while maintaining the tonal value or local color or whatever. And so it gives you another dimension to play around with, to express yourself, and another dimension of just observation as you're painting. So putting all these things together, because of the simplicity, because you're going to gain all this experience working within a system, because you're going to learn the ins and outs in a really powerful way of all your colors, ultimately it'll give you a lot of confidence, and it will help you in a lot of ways to feel better about your artwork, to feel better about being able to tackle difficult scenes, to feel like you can go for it. And so I think that's one of the biggest assets of using a limited palette. It's not always perfect. You can't always achieve every single effect with every limited palette. But that, again, then it leads you to experimentation. It leads to greater knowledge and power for your art making. So try these tips out. Remember, you have a voice that matters. Go be creative. I'll see you next time.